Moscow, Soviet Union, September 1976. The afternoon sun hung low over Red Square, casting long shadows across the cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The air carried the first hint of autumn, that particular crispness that settles over the Soviet capital as summer surrenders to the inevitable Russian winter. Among the tourists and locals moving through the square, one man walked with measured steps, his eyes taking in the architectural grandeur of the Kremlin walls, the onion domes of St. Basil's Cathedral, the austere monumentality of Lenin's mausoleum. To any observer, he appeared unremarkable, a Western businessman perhaps, or an academic attending one of the many conferences that served as elaborate pretexts for both sides to monitor their adversaries. But beneath the sleeve of his conservative suit jacket, strapped to his wrist with apparent casualness, sat one of the most sophisticated pieces of espionage technology yet devised by the Central Intelligence Agency, a fully functional camera disguised as an ordinary wristwatch. The man's name remains classified to this day, buried in files that bear the highest security clearances, known only by cryptonyms and operational designations in the endless paper trail of Cold War intelligence operations. What is known is this: he was an operative of exceptional skill, a man who had survived the Byzantine complexities of Moscow station operations during one of the most dangerous periods of East-West confrontation. His mission on that September afternoon was both simple and impossibly difficult: to photograph sensitive locations throughout the Soviet capital without detection, to gather intelligence that satellites could not capture and human observation could not reliably retain, to do what seemed impossible in a city where the Committee for State Security, the feared KGB, had spent decades perfecting the art of surveillance and counter-surveillance. The wristwatch on his arm represented more than technology. It represented the desperate ingenuity of an intelligence service trying to see through the Iron Curtain, to pierce the veil of secrecy that had descended across half of Europe and much of Asia in the decades since the end of the Second World War. The Cold War had, by 1976, settled into a kind of grim routine, a deadly dance performed by professionals on both sides who understood that while détente might ease tensions publicly, the shadow war of intelligence gathering continued unabated. Photography had always been central to this secret conflict. From the earliest days of espionage, the camera had served as the spy's most reliable tool, faster than memory, more accurate than notes, capable of capturing the minutiae that might prove decisive in understanding an adversary's capabilities and intentions. But in Moscow, under the ever-watchful eyes of the KGB's surveillance apparatus, conventional photography was nearly impossible. Tourists carrying cameras were monitored, their films sometimes confiscated or exposed, their movements tracked by watchers who blended seamlessly into the crowds. Embassy personnel faced even stricter scrutiny, their residences and offices riddled with listening devices, their every movement outside diplomatic compounds documented by teams of surveillance specialists whose patience was as legendary as their thoroughness. Langley, Virginia, 3 years earlier, June 1973, the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency sprawled across its wooded campus in the Virginia suburbs, a fortress of secrets where the world's crises were analyzed, where operations were planned with meticulous care. In a secure facility within the agency's Directorate of Science and Technology, a small team of engineers and intelligence officers gathered around a conference table to examine a problem that had vexed Moscow Station for years. How could operatives photograph targets in the Soviet Union without the cumbersome cameras that inevitably drew attention? The answer emerged from the intersection of miniaturization technology and operational necessity. Throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, the consumer electronics industry had achieved remarkable advances in making devices smaller, lighter, more portable. The engineers at Langley began to ask a question that seemed to belong more to the realm of spy fiction than operational reality. Could a camera be built into a functioning wristwatch? Could such a device be made? Reliable enough for field use, discreet enough to escape notice, simple enough that an operative under stress could use it without error? The technical challenges were formidable. A camera requires several fundamental components: a lens system to focus light, a shutter mechanism to control exposure, film to record the image, and a means of advancing the film for multiple exposures. All of this had to fit within the confines of a watch case while still maintaining the appearance and functionality of an actual timepiece. The watch needed to keep accurate time, to look convincing under casual inspection, to survive the rigors of field operations, including changes in temperature, humidity, and the inevitable stresses of active use. Moreover, it needed to be operated with absolute discretion, no obvious buttons to press, no telltale sounds of shutters clicking, no behaviors that would alert even a trained observer to its true purpose. The project that emerged was designated with one of those deliberately bland code names that intelligence agencies favor. The engineers worked in secret, drawing on expertise from multiple disciplines. Optical specialists designed lens systems that could fit within a watch crystal. Mechanical engineers devised shutter mechanisms that operated almost silently, triggered by subtle manipulations that could be performed without looking at the watch. The result, after months of prototyping and testing, was a device that looked like an unremarkable stainless steel wristwatch, but contained within its case a fully functional camera capable of taking multiple photographs. The watch camera used a disc of specialized film housed in the watch body that could be rotated to capture a sequence of images. The lens was concealed behind what appeared to be a normal watch crystal, positioned so that when the wearer angled their wrist naturally, the camera pointed forward. The shutter was triggered by pressing what seemed to be the watch's crown, a motion so subtle and natural that even someone standing close might not notice. Each watch could capture approximately 24 images before requiring a film change. The photographs, when developed, would be small, but under magnification could reveal remarkable detail. Moscow Station, October 1973. The first watch cameras arrived at the American Embassy in Moscow in a diplomatic pouch, nested in protective foam, accompanied by classified technical manuals and operational guidelines. The station chief, a career intelligence officer who had served in some of the agency's most challenging posts, examined the devices with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Moscow was perhaps the most demanding operational environment in the world. The KGB's surveillance net was dense and sophisticated, their counterintelligence capabilities honed by decades of experience and paranoid vigilance. The station selected its most experienced operatives for initial testing. These were men and women who had demonstrated exceptional operational security, who understood the rhythms of Moscow surveillance, who could recognize when they were being followed. The training was intensive. Operatives practiced photographing targets without looking at their wrists, learning to point the camera by developing an intuitive sense of where their hand directed the lens. They rehearsed the subtle motion of triggering the shutter, practiced advancing the film with movements that appeared natural. The first operational uses were cautious, almost timid. Operatives would photograph locations already well documented by other means, testing whether the images produced were of sufficient quality to be useful. The results were encouraging. The cameras produced images that, while not matching the quality of professional photographic equipment, were nonetheless adequate for intelligence purposes. Building facades, vehicle license plates, the general layout of facilities, all could be documented with reasonable clarity. More importantly, the operatives reported that using the watch camera felt natural, that the risks of detection seemed minimal. A man checking his watch was the most ordinary of gestures, performed thousands of times daily throughout any city. As confidence grew, the operational tempo increased. Watch cameras began to be used for more ambitious targets. Operatives photographed the entrances to suspected KGB facilities, documented the comings and goings at military administrative buildings, captured images of individuals identified as intelligence officers or officials in sensitive positions. The watches proved particularly valuable for pattern-of-life analysis, the systematic documentation of routines and behaviors that, over time, revealed vulnerabilities and opportunities. Directorate K, KGB Headquarters, Lubyanka Square, Moscow, January 1975. In the heart of the Soviet security apparatus, Colonel Aleksei Mikhailovich Volkov, a 20-year veteran of counterintelligence operations, sat reviewing surveillance reports with growing concern. Several suspected CIA operatives had been observed engaging in behaviors that seemed innocuous, but suggested intelligence activity. The pattern was subtle: Western diplomats visiting locations of no obvious interest, standing in positions that offered clear views of sensitive facilities, their hands positioned in ways that seemed unnecessarily deliberate. The surveillance teams had found nothing concrete, no cameras observed, no obvious photography taking place. Yet Volkov's instincts told him that something was occurring beneath the surface. Volkov ordered enhanced surveillance on several suspects, instructing his teams to document every action in minute detail. The surveillance photographs would later prove revealing. In several instances, the teams captured images of suspects, checking their wristwatches at moments that seemed inconsistent with any practical need to know the time. Standing before buildings, facing specific directions, their wrists angled in particular ways. The behavior was repeated across multiple subjects and multiple occasions, suggesting a pattern. Volkov considered various explanations. The possibility that the watches themselves might be cameras seemed almost too clever, too miniaturized to be practical. Yet Volkov was too experienced to dismiss any possibility without investigation. The KGB's technical services were directed to investigate whether miniature cameras could be built into wristwatches. Their conclusion was sobering. Such devices were theoretically possible, but would require sophisticated manufacturing capabilities. If the Americans had indeed developed watch cameras, they represented a significant technical achievement and a serious operational threat. Volkov prepared a classified report for his superiors, warning that a new form of technical surveillance might be in use, recommending enhanced scrutiny of any Western personnel observed checking watches in proximity to sensitive locations. Moscow, Soviet Union, September 1976. This was the context into which our operative walked on that autumn afternoon, carrying his watch camera through Red Square. The intelligence he sought was specific and time-sensitive. The CIA had received reports suggesting changes in security procedures at certain Soviet government facilities. Satellite photography could capture the exteriors of buildings, but satellites could not document the details visible at street level, the positions of guards, the types of locks on doors, the patterns of personnel movement. The operative's route had been planned with meticulous care. He would visit several locations that day, each chosen to seem plausible as tourist destinations, while offering views of targets of interest. At specific locations, predetermined during planning sessions, he would stop and check his watch. The gesture appeared entirely natural, a tourist confirming the time. In reality, each check represented a photograph, a fraction of a second, when light passed through the miniature lens and exposed the sensitive film. The first several photographs were insurance shots, documenting locations already known, but worth updating. The operative's heart rate remained steady, his breathing controlled. Years of training had taught him to manage the physical responses to stress, to maintain the outer appearance of calm, regardless of internal tension. He knew he was likely under surveillance. In Moscow, one always assumed observation, but the question was whether the watchers recognized his true purpose. What the operative could not know was that he was being watched, not by routine surveillance, but by a specialized team from Directorate K, officers who had been briefed specifically on the watch camera threat. They observed from multiple positions, documenting his movements with both written notes and their own photographic equipment. They noted each time he checked his watch, the precise locations, the directions he faced. The evidence was mounting, but the KGB team maintained their distance. The decision to arrest or expel a foreign intelligence operative was never taken lightly. Such actions had diplomatic consequences. Better to document, to understand the full extent of what was being photographed, to potentially identify other operatives using similar techniques. The American Embassy, Moscow, that evening. The operative returned to the embassy compound as evening shadows lengthened, passing through security checkpoints. The watch remained on his wrist, innocent in appearance, now containing within its case nearly 24 exposed images. in a specialized darkroom maintained by the station's technical services officer. The watch was carefully disassembled, the film disc removed and prepared for development. The development process revealed photographs of varying quality, but consistent utility. The watch camera's limitations were evident. Some images were slightly blurred. Others showed exposure problems. But the essential intelligence was there. Clear views of building entrances, documentation of security measures, images of personnel, whose faces would be run through the CIA's extensive photographic databases. The station chief reviewed the photographs with satisfaction tempered by caution. What the station chief did not yet know was that the KGB had documented the entire operation. The decision-making process within the KGB was deliberative. Should they move immediately against this operative, expelling him and alerting the Americans that their watch cameras had been compromised? Or should they allow the operations to continue, using the Americans' own intelligence activities to identify additional operatives and map the extent of CIA interests in Moscow? KGB headquarters, Lubyanka, 2 days later. The decision was made at the highest levels of the Second Chief Directorate. The watch camera operations would be allowed to continue, for now, but under intense observation. Every suspected CIA operative would be tracked, their watch-checking behaviors documented and analyzed. This patience reflected a deeper strategic calculation. Intelligence services learn as much from watching their adversaries operate as they do from preventing those operations. But patience had limits. The KGB also began preparing countermeasures. Technical teams worked on methods to detect miniature cameras. At sensitive facilities, security was quietly enhanced. Personnel were instructed to be alert for individuals checking watches repeatedly. The KGB understood they could not prevent all foreign intelligence collection, but they could increase the risks and, when the time was right, make arrests that would disrupt CIA operations. For several months, an uneasy equilibrium persisted. CIA operatives continued using watch cameras, unaware that many operations were being documented by counter-surveillance teams. The intelligence gathered flowed back to Langley, contributing to the vast mosaic of information about Soviet capabilities. The KGB watched and documented, building cases, identifying patterns. Sheremetyevo Airport, Moscow, March 1977. The equilibrium shattered on a cold morning when 3 American diplomats were detained at the airport as they attempted to board a flight to Helsinki. The detention was coordinated and public. Uniformed KGB officers moved in with precision. The Americans were taken to private rooms where they were searched thoroughly, and on each man's wrist was found a watch that upon examination proved to be a camera. Within hours, Soviet news agencies were reporting the incident, describing it as the exposure of American espionage activities. Photographs of the watch cameras were released. The 3 operatives were declared persona non grata and expelled. The Moscow station was devastated. 3 experienced operatives had been burned, their covers destroyed. Worse, the watch camera program was now completely compromised. Every intelligence service in the world would see the Soviet revelations, would know to watch for such devices. The KGB's patience had paid dividends. By waiting, by observing multiple operations, they had been able to roll up not just one operative but several, delivering a blow to American intelligence operations that would take months to recover from. Langley, Virginia, April 1977. In the secure conference rooms where Moscow operations were reviewed, the Post. Mortem was painful but necessary. Analysis of the timeline suggested the KGB had likely detected the watch cameras months earlier, possibly even during the first operational uses. The compromise had not been technical, but operational, a function of the inherent difficulty of conducting clandestine photography in the most surveillance-intensive environment on Earth. Yet even in failure, there were lessons and successes. During the operational life of the watch camera program, before its compromise, CIA operatives had captured hundreds of photographs, documenting changes in Soviet security procedures, identifying personnel, mapping facilities. The watch cameras had proven the concept. Miniaturized cameras could be built into everyday objects, could be used operationally, could gather intelligence that other methods could not obtain. The watch camera program did not end with the Moscow exposures. It evolved. Engineers at Langley created new concealment methods, new approaches to miniature photography. Future versions would be built into different objects, would use different operational techniques, would be deployed where surveillance was less intense. Some remained classified for decades, their existence revealed only long after the Cold War had ended. Epilogue: A Quiet Morning, decades later. The National Cryptologic Museum, located near Fort Meade, Maryland, contains among its extensive collections a small display case devoted to Cold War espionage technology. Inside, mounted on a small pedestal, sits an unremarkable-looking wristwatch. The timepiece appears ordinary. Stainless steel case, simple dial, leather band showing the wear of use. Only the explanatory placard reveals its true nature, a CIA camera watch used during operations in Moscow during the 1970s. The watch sits silent behind its protective glass, a relic of battles fought in secret, of risks taken and operations compromised, of the thousands who served in the shadow war between superpowers. The visitors who pause to read its story cannot know all the details. Some remain classified, others have been lost as participants aged and memories faded. But the essential truth remains. During the Cold War, intelligence officers wore cameras on their wrists and walked through Moscow photographing secrets. And for a time before the inevitable exposure, they succeeded in seeing what was meant to remain hidden. The Cold War ended more than 3 decades ago. The Soviet Union dissolved, the Berlin Wall fell, the Iron Curtain lifted. Many involved in the watch camera operations have passed away, taking their detailed memories with them. But the watch in the museum case endures as physical evidence of an extraordinary moment when technology and courage combined to pierce the veil of secrecy. When ingenuity briefly overcame surveillance, when a device masquerading as something ordinary achieved something remarkable. The watch behind the glass represents the tensions and fears, the innovations and adaptations, the human dimension of a conflict fought not with armies in open battle, but with secrets and those who sought to discover them.